Hi everyone, this is Utsab. So today I will be talking about how to make fluid layouts with multi-column grids. So actually, not elastic, we're not covering that today, but yeah, so what do I mean by a fluid layout? You can think of it as the opposite of a fixed layout. So there's kind of these fixed layouts versus fluid layouts. Let me illustrate with a couple of examples here. Workflow itself uses a fixed layout. So you'll notice how the sizes of the columns don't really change. This whole rectangular area where I'm writing stays constant no matter how big the page is. Same thing with like these items here and the search box and all that stuff is just, it's constant. In contrast, if I go to a site like Amazon, so notice how, look at these two boxes here, the healthy crisp greens and then shop Valentine's Day gift ideas. As I scroll in and out, those boxes actually get bigger or smaller. So that's what we would call a fluid layout. You can also have a mixture of both. You can notice how the this column here on the right is fixed. It does not change size. There are advantages to doing fluid and fixed. There's a huge debate around, which one should you use and when. It really depends on the situation, but it's really good to know both. Understanding fluid layouts is a little bit more complex, so I'll teach you guys that. Fixed layouts are relatively easier to handle. So let's get started here. I'll start with the demo. Let me draw out what I want to do here. So let's clear this guy. So if this is our page, right, we want to put a header, and we'll make a 2-column layout to start with. All right, and then we'll put a footer down below. Okay, so we're going to build that first, and then we will build another one with a 3-column layout. So then we'll build a 3-column layout that looks like similar deal. Header, and then you'll have a left, and then a middle, and then a right, plus our usual footer down here. Okay, we'll start with this one, the 2-column layout, because the concepts are a little bit easier to grasp here. Let me open up a page. Okay, starting from scratch, it's an HTML document. You can type HTML and hit tab. Nice trick in Sublime, it'll pre-populate everything. We are missing the doc type up here though, so let me just grab that. So remember, the doc type lets the browser know that you are running HTML5 syntax. All right, let's get started with this thing. First step, as always, is to think of the HTML markup before you get started. So we're going to have our header, right? Header. We'll have our. So actually, just one thing I'm going to do here preemptively. I'm going to put everything inside of a wrapper. So I'll make this a div, ID equals a wrapper. And the reason for that is that often you will want to have some kind of global padding or margin or width on your page. The wrapper will often come in handy later on down the line, and we'll see that illustrated later. So close the wrapper. By the way, good practice, whenever you are opening any kind of element, immediately write the closing tag for that element. Don't start coding like this and assume you're going to remember to close it at the end. A more common problem is you will forget, and then you'll have some weird bug that will take you an hour to debug. So just as a practice, as soon as you write the opening, close it immediately. Okay, so we've got our header. Now I'm going to, I know there are HTML5 elements for this, but just to illustrate that we're really just working with divs here, I'm just going to use divs. At the end, we can change it back to the HTML5 equivalent of, you know, main and whatnot. So this one's, I'll call it ID main, main content. And then this one, we'll call it ID side. Okay, side content. And then finally, we'll have our footer. Footer. Okay, so let's just run this and see what we have. Okay. Cool. Pretty much what we expected. So what have we talked about so far? We have covered fixed versus fluid, and then explaining the wrapper div around the entire layout. The next thing we're going to talk about is how we're going to achieve our columns. For that, floats are going to be very useful for that. Basically, we will float this guy to the left and this guy to the right. Let's go ahead and try that. Style. So, main. Float left. Side, float right. And we'll give it a width. So we'll give our main content a width of 70%. We'll give our side content a width of 30%. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, cool. Kind of looks reasonable. Let's go ahead and put a background color on all of these divs just to see exactly how much space they're taking up. So background, let's give this 999. We'll just use different shades of gray. Background 666. Okay. Let's give something to the header and footer also. Header, background. Let's make it dark. Let's see, 444. And footer, we can do the same thing. And let's just make the font color more visible. Cool. Okay, so now you can see how that is fluid. As you make the browser smaller, the column sizes adjust. Just to make it look more reasonable, I'll put some more text in there. Let's see, I have some Ipsum text. So here, 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 sign. Okay. And let's refresh the page. Okay, cool. So notice one thing, the footer looks weird. We would kind of expect it to be below both of these guys. That's because we did not clear our floats. Remember, whenever you're using floats, the element immediately after it needs to be cleared if it's going to appear below both of them. So our footer, we can do it like this. Clear both. Now if we refresh the page, there you go. Now the footer appears below both of them. Okay, cool. So now let's talk about how we can make this look a little bit better. We'll put a gutter between these two columns. A gutter is just that spacing so that it looks like they're separated. Yeah. Okay, so actually, yeah, just a couple more points about why floats are useful. We saw that when we use floats, we can easily put a footer underneath those floats just by clearing the floats. Back in the day, they would use things like absolute positioning and whatnot, and it was just really awkward to put a footer below that. It just wasn't very flexible, but yeah, I mean, there's some history behind why that's useful, but floating is, people really appreciate that clearing option. The other thing is that ordering of content in your HTML does matter. So notice how we were able to put our main content right up top in our HTML. That will become useful for certain kind of devices that don't render CSS very well. I know it's kind of hard to imagine that, but there are devices out there that may not render your CSS. And in that case, whichever one comes first in your HTML will appear at the top of the page. So it would not be very good if your less important information were at the top, because then they would have to scroll down to see the main content. In this case, it's not that big of a deal because there's only 2 columns, but you can imagine if there were 3 columns or 4 columns and you really want to prioritize the main column so that it appears at the top of the HTML. Okay. So now moving on, we'll talk about how to make a gutter. So there's going to be some challenges here with fluid layouts. And so I'll illustrate one thing. Suppose we were to just put a margin between these columns. What would happen? It seems like the obvious thing to do. Well, let's try that. Let's go ahead and I'll put a margin right of 20 pixels. So now there's not enough space on the row to hold both columns, and the reason is this is still taking 70%, this is taking 30%, that equals 100%. If we're going to add 20 pixel of margin, now you have exceeded the total width of the row. So this is a complication with fluid layouts because it's kind of awkward to combine percentages and pixel margins, pixel anything, because those are fixed. So we'll see, how we can work with that. So one technique for this is to put a div inside of a div. We'll have a container div. Let's see how that would look. So we'll put in an internal div called content here. Oops. And remember, as soon as I make that div, I'm going to close it so that I don't forget. Okay, let's just render that to make sure that works. Let me actually delete this margin thing here. Okay. So, all right, it looks fine. So now how do we put the margin back in there? We're going to put the margin on content itself. Main content. So this means, oh, there we go. This means all elements inside main with ID content will get this style. So we'll go ahead and put our margin right here. Okay, now let's see what that looks like. Okay. So if you were to examine this, you would see that you kind of have this internal div, which has a margin right. There's like 20 pixels right there. Let's make it a little bit more pronounced. So we'll put the background on the internal div so you can see that. There you go. So now if you kind of see what's happening here, you still have your div as a whole, which is with ID main, that's still 70%. Now you have a div inside of that div called content, which has the gray background, and it has a margin of 20 pixels. So again, this is the kind of the markup here. It might be easier to see it in the inspect element. Okay, so notice that you have your, let's see if I can show it all on one screen here. So you've got your div called main. Okay. There you go. So you've got your div called main, right? This has width 70%. It's floated to the left. Inside that div, you have content. Content has the background color of gray, and it has a margin right of 20 pixels. I hope that's clear. Okay. So that's how we would put a gutter. This white space thing, we refer to that as a gutter. Okay, so we kind of, there's another way to do it where you use percentages. We won't talk about that, but basically, the wrapper div is a good way to go. So I talked about that. Now, padding within a column. Okay, so you'll see, you know, you've got your text. It doesn't look very good. There's, it would be nice if we could put some spacing around the text. So let's see how we would do that. So again, if we used our kind of, you know, naive approach, we might think, okay, well, let's just put padding on the div. Let's see what happens there. I'll put a padding of 20 pixels. All right. Bam. Okay. Similar problem. And actually, we don't want it there. We want it here. We want it on our internal div. That's the thing with the background color now. And you'll notice how that actually worked. I just didn't realize that would work, but that totally would work because, well, let's compare the two. Why did this not work? if I put it on the parent div. Well, why does this break? Well, it has to do with the way that width is calculated in the box model. In the previous video you watched, I explained how the width is equal to the, let's see, let me write it down here. So traditional box model, the width is equal to the content width plus the padding plus the border. So in this case, we've got width is equal to 70% plus 20 pixels on the left for the padding, plus 20 pixels on the right. Plus, we don't have a border, so that's 0. So on the parent div, it's now exceeding the total width of that row. Because remember, we have the aside, which has a width of 30%, right? So you got 70% plus 30%, which is equal to 100%, plus all this extra padding now. That's why it doesn't fit. But then why does it fit in the case where we put the padding not on the main div, but in the internal div? Why does that work? Well, because it's on the internal div does not have the width of 70%. It doesn't have that. The parent div has that. So now, basically, just the way that the browser is going to compute the widths is that it's still going to maintain the parent div to be 70%, and the internal div will kind of have its own kind of metric, like its own total width, and its total width will just shrink accordingly if you give it more padding. It's a little complicated, but just as long as you understand why this does not work, with the parent div, how it exceeds 100%, then you're good. And just be aware that putting an internal div and putting the padding inside that is a workaround. Okay, so sorry, where was I? Okay, so if I refresh the page, that does not work. Did I not save it? Yeah, okay. So looks a little better. Let's do it for this side here. So I'll just illustrate it the same way. Again, we'll try it the naive way for a side. I'll put a padding of 20 pixels. And you'll see that breaks the flow because now it's too wide. We've got the 30% plus 20 pixels as the total width. That's not going to work. So we'll make an internal div. Div ID equals aside content. I guess maybe it would have been better to call it a class up here. Class content. Whatever. It's calling it aside content for now. Okay. So now we got our div and then an internal div, which actually contains the content for the aside. We'll now put the padding on the internal div. So this is aside content, and we're just going to copy this, put it here. Actually, it doesn't really matter where the background is this time, but whatever. Okay. And that looks a little weird. What happened to our background color? What just happened? Did I misspell something? Let's see. Oh, yeah. That was an equal sign, so typo. There you go. Okay. So it looks better, right? You can kind of see the page taking shape there. Cool. Let's go ahead and put some padding on the header and footer too, just to make that look decent. Let's go padding 20 pixels. Padding 20 pixels. Okay, a little better. Great. Okay, so this internal div thing trick, it works fine. There's actually a kind of a much more simple way to do this now with CSS3, and it's called the box. What was it called? The box. Blanking on the name. Box sizing, right? Okay. So with box sizing, we can actually solve this problem of the width being greater than the content width. With box sizing, we can have the padding and the border kind of be included within the declared width. So let's see what that would look like. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I'll bring it back to where it was. Okay. And I'll put this back up there. Okay, so now what do we predict will happen here? The page is going to break again, right? It's too big. This side is too wide, so it'll spill over onto the next line, unless we use a box sizing property. So we can do box sizing border box. Okay. Now, bam. This works because the 30%, this has a width of 30%, but now the padding is kind of being included within that width instead of being added to that width. This is such a useful thing. It's very intuitive that a common practice, and I would recommend this as well, is to just give all of your elements that style. You can do that with this syntax, like that. Cool. Right. The advantage of that is that it also simplifies your HTML. You don't need to have all those internal divs and whatnot. Unfortunately, for the margin, you still need to, for the gutter, you still need to do some kind of trick like that, because the width. Okay, so the width now will include padding and border, still does not include margin. Yeah, I have a resource that that links to the box sizing property. I highly recommend you read that. Okay. So, right, we talk about the CSS box sizing property. Great. That is pretty much what you would need to know to do a 2-column grid. You see it's fluid, right? Expands. One more thing we're going to do, though, is sometimes you don't want it to shrink too much. If you shrink too much, it can look ugly, or maybe it won't even make sense. And same thing with, you don't want it to be too wide, then that might also kind of ruin the flow of your page. So the way to get around that is to put a min and a max width on your page. For that, we're going to come back to that wrapper div that we talked about at the very beginning. Remember this div? The wrapper div. This includes everything. So we can put a min and a max width on that wrapper. So min width, let's say 600 pixels. Max width, let's say 1200 pixels. Let's see what that does for us. Okay, so now you'll notice it gets smaller to a point. Now it's not going to get any smaller. It hit its min width of 600 pixels. Okay, now we'll see if we can hit the max width. Yeah, so at this point, it's hit the max width of 1200 pixels. It's not going to get any bigger. That's what the syntax does for us. Min width, max width, wrapper. Okay, my computer's frozen. Okay. Why? Jeez. Okay, I'm just going to quit Sublime. Okay, there it is. There's Chrome. Okay. Okay, let me give this one more shot here. All right. So that is a 2-column layout. I'm going to do a quick demo of the 3-column layout. Pretty much the same concepts, but slightly more complicated HTML. So let's talk about this. Our 3-column layout is this guy here. We're going to have a left, middle, and a right. If you remember, left, middle, right. How would we modify our structure here? So the basic idea, let me explain it just visually here. So compared to the 2-column layout, remember we basically floated this one to the left, float, and then we floated this one to the right. We're going to do something similar here, but we're going to put a containing structure around the whole, around this part of the page. We'll put like some kind of div container around the whole thing. And then we'll float this one to the left within that div, and we'll float this one to the right within that div. And then this thing will be floated to the right as it normally would. And then this entire container will be floated to the left as well. Let's demonstrate that. Where's Sublime? Oh, I totally closed Sublime. Okay. Here. Open with Sublime. Okay. So let's go ahead and we'll put this entire thing inside of a container. Div ID equals main container. In fact, just to be super clear, I'll just call it main and left column container. Okay. Now, let's see. I'm gonna close that div. Remember, close it immediately. So, where is it? Right below this guy. Div. And I'll put a little comment there. And this is a good practice, by the way, to make your code readable. Just put like a little ending tag wherever your closing tag is, a little ending comment. Okay, and then let me fix the indentation. There you go. And I'll put the left column here. Div ID equals left column. Okay, and let's just copy some of this stuff. Put it there. All right. Cool. So let's just see what that looks like. It's going to be very broken, but remember, test often. Grid. Okay, cool. So this is our new left column thing. It's not appearing in the right place. Let's just give it a background color just so we can keep track of it. Div left column. Okay, let's make this one red, yellow. Okay, let's run that. Cool, it's yellow. Now we will float this entire thing to the left. Okay. Float left, and this entire section will get the width of 70%. And we will delete that from up here. Right? Because now it's the container as a whole, which will get that 70% width. If you remember back to our diagram, this whole red container as a whole will get 70%. And then this section here will get 30%. Okay. Let's run that, see what that looks like. Okay, cool. So now this container as a whole gets 70%. Looks a little bit closer. So now what we'll do is we'll float the main to the right. Okay. And we'll float the left column to the left. Okay, cool. Now, to make this fit, we'll give them widths. So again, we're going to do some kind of percentage. So we'll say width, let's see what happens, 50%. And left column we'll do with 50%. Cool. So you see, like, they each take 50% of their container, right? All right. So we didn't really talk about the gutters, but same concept. I'm not going to demonstrate that because this is already a long video. This is basically the idea. This is now you have this 3-column layout. It has a flexible grid, has a min and a max width. You can probably look at a variety of websites now and can inspect how they did their grid system and understand what they did. In fact, that is an exercise. So the exercise is to find any website with a multi-column layout, and I'd like you to reverse engineer it. Use Chrome DevTools, inspect element, and then write a little paragraph here just explaining the strategy that they use to build their layout. Tell me whether it's fluid or whether it's fixed. How did they create the gutters? How do they add padding around the content? One question I have is, think of a situation where you would want to employ the max width property on a column. So remember, we added the max and min width at the end so that the page doesn't stretch too far or get too small. Can you think of some specific situations where you would absolutely, need to use a max width property or a min width property? What would necessitate that? There you go. That is how you create a grid and make it fluid.